Can we actually trust the people that translate the Bible? That is such an important question. I'm Michael Hoff with Digital Theologian, and recently I had the opportunity to sit down with New Testament professor and Dean of Ashland Theological Seminary, Dr. John Byron. And that was one of the questions that I made sure to ask him. Now, Dr. Byron has worked on translation himself, so he had some special insight to give to the rest of us about the process of translation and what really motivates translators who are working on modern English translations. I hope you find the video helpful, and I'll see you on the other side. I've been doing a series on the Bible, I think 4 or 5 videos in at this point, and really wanting to help people understand and appreciate the a lot of the things that are behind the Bible, right? How can we know that it's reliable? How did we end up with the English Bibles we have now? And I remember you presenting a handful of years ago at Bethel when I was on staff there. You were gracious enough to come to our School of Ministry and speak. And I've had students come back time and time again about how helpful it was hearing from you in that context about how we can know we can trust the New Testament. And as a New Testament scholar, I just wanted to hear from you a little bit. What is it that gives you a reasonable trust that the New Testament is a reliable historical document?
Yeah, well, that's fine. It's interesting. People at times have this concept, and I get it. We go to Walmart and you can buy a Bible right off the shelf. And I'll admit right away that that just sounds wrong that you can buy a Bible from Walmart.
Yeah.
Um, but it's just because of the Bible. We think it should be, maybe there should be a sacred bookstore or something. But what's interesting is people, because the Bible comes to us between two covers, we assume that that's the way the Bible is delivered to us. And we fail sometimes to appreciate that the Bible was written over thousands of years. And it was not written all by the same person. It wasn't written all in the same language. It was certainly not even written in the same historical context. And the fact is, we don't have any of the original copies. And that really makes people become a bit, oh my gosh, well, how can we trust this? And
Yeah.
the truth is, yeah, what we have are copies of copies, because people use the Bible. It's made of biodegradable material. I mean, it just disappeared. That's what happens. And there's no computer disks, no digital cloud to save things on in those days. But when we look through, and let me just focus just for a minute on a couple of things, Michael. Until 1947, our oldest, most reliable copies of the Old Testament, for instance, were dating back only about 1,000 years, known as part of the Masoretic tradition, and they were good manuscripts. We could go into detail and talk about how accurate their copying skills were, how particular they were. But in 1947, when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, where there is a copy of, or at least a fragment of, every book of the Old Testament, with the exception of Esther, we discovered that much of what we had was very good. We actually improved some of our current copies and translations. What we got from the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed some things, and we literally improved our manuscript evidence by 1,200 years in one day. And then you look at like the New Testament. When the King James Bible, for instance, was first published, the New Testament was based on only 6 Greek manuscripts. And again, they're copies of copies. But there's a real science called textual criticism that people that are in the business of studying these manuscripts, they have the very same interest that you and I do. They want the best possible copy of the Bible they can. They want to get as close back to the original as possible. And so it's not in their interest to be fooling you or to trying to deceive you. Let me just give you a quick rundown, and this is just broadly speaking of what we have just for the New Testament. We have approximately 5,700 different Greek manuscripts in whole or part for the New Testament. And then because Latin was such a big language at one time and the Bible was written in Latin, we got 10,000 manuscripts in Latin. And then there's other that we don't even know about: Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Georgian, Slavonic. So here's the thing: copying the Bible is and translating it into other languages is a very Christian practice right from the beginning. Jesus spoke Aramaic, but they didn't write the Gospels in Aramaic. They wrote them in Greek, right? And then they got translated into Latin. Now we translate them into English for us. And then also at the same time, we can go back to early church fathers. I'll mention one that many people know, Augustine, for instance. They would quote the Bible. We can compare those quotes that they're using and figure out what they were quoting and what the Bible looked like. So there's a real science here that goes back to this. Are there differences between manuscripts? Yes. Sometimes they're not as dramatic as sometimes we're made to believe. Sometimes there are some pretty dramatic differences, and we can talk about those as well. But nonetheless, we have pretty good confidence, fairly good confidence, that we have an idea of what the originals look like.
Yeah, that's good. I think that a lot of people are maybe a little shaken by the fact that we don't have those original copies, right? People want to know, like, hey, where can I go see the original Bible? I mean, that's something that people search for online. Like, where is the original Bible? And it's like, well, as you said, it's not there. So, I think sometimes people maybe buy in a little bit to conspiracies because they make a better story. Thank you, Dan Brown and others. But you know, could you, as somebody who's worked on Bible translation, can you speak to, just the mindset that's behind that maybe a little bit more, and just because I think that at times sometimes as people are discussing this, they want to make it out as though it's people that are maybe disconnected from the Christian faith or trying to, maybe take away things from the Word of God or push a specific agenda. And can you speak to that at all?
Sure. You mentioned I worked on a Bible translation. I worked on what is known as the Common English Bible. And I'll just bring it up right now is I actually worked on the book of Judith, which is in the Apocrypha. And we can talk more about that later if you like. But the reason I even chose to do this was because I got to work in the Apocrypha. And I think Christians should read the Apocrypha. And we can talk more about that later. But I actually, again, what I said, the reason why they had to convince me was we've got a lot of good Bible translations out there, and I have great confidence in it. The process when we go through this is we have basically what I would call an agreed upon text these days that has been worked over, like I said, by text critics. So this would be the text that we're using for the New Testament. In my case, it was in the Apocrypha for Judith. And what I did in that process, in order for us to go through the process of translating, is first of all, I was asked to translate Judith from Greek into English, a fresh translation, but I was challenged to do it at a sixth grade reading level. And the reason is that the average newspaper is at the sixth grade level as well. Even though we have a very high literacy rate, let's just use North America here as an example. We've got like an 85% literacy rate. The fact is, most of us, most of what we're exposed to doesn't take us above a sixth grade vocabulary and reading level. So when I was translating it, there's actually tools in software that actually help you to grade the reading level at which you're doing. So if you wrote a paper or something, and just as a side note, because there's so many strange names and geographical terms in Judith, I was constantly being told that I was doing it at like a 19th grade level, by the software. So, but really the idea here was you're trying to keep in mind who is it that you're sending, who it is that's going to be reading this. And the goal is for people that are sitting in the pew in church. When I was done, then it went to another scholar, and I happen to know this person, and she looked over it for me, and she went through and she may have made some suggested changes. Maybe some areas I wasn't as clear, or maybe she helped soften some things out. And then the next thing they did was they actually took it before a group of people, literally in a church basement, and read it to see if these people even understood what it is I was trying to say. Because the problem is, I may think it's understandable, but I'm working in my own little bubble here. And my co-translator, who she also may have that, but when we finally were taking it down to the level we were aiming at, then changes were made and suggestions were made so that we could finally give them the most accurate translation in English, yet at the same time, one that was the most accessible. So,
And I've encouraged people to avoid a translation that's done by one individual, and that back and forth with another scholar is a great example of that. That you're having somebody that's critically evaluating your work. They're questioning it. They're pushing back some places. I think that that's so helpful. And I've said, while I love Eugene Peterson, and we read Eat This Book, as a part of one of the hermeneutics courses that was offered there at Ashland years ago, and it was very formative for me. I still didn't recommend the Message as a study Bible for anyone, simply because it's done by one person, and if you get free enough and loose enough with the text that you don't need verse numbers, you probably shouldn't use it as a study Bible. And if you want to use it as devotional material, by all means, go ahead. And so I think that it's helpful for people to see that in this process that there are some checks and balances, and it's not trying to push. So if I'm hearing you correctly, the publishers weren't pushing a specific agenda, they were pushing a reading level, and to make sure that it was a fresh translation accessible to people today.
yeah, and let me get one that's probably the most popular one, and that is the New International Version, which has approximately 40% of the Bible share market in North America. It's a very popular translation.
Yeah.
And people have accused it of being New Age verses. I remember a few years ago when we were doing a little more gender inclusive translation, and
Right.
rather than just saying when Paul's letters, brothers, they would say brothers and sisters. And people were, well, you're adding, and I'm like, to the word of God. Not really. What you're trying to do is, a translation is not like a connect the dot on the back of a cereal box where you're trying to make a puzzle solution. Really, language works in such a way that you have to also have a sense of what was the author saying. And when in those days when they used very gender specific language, it included everybody. So let me give you an example. When Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, in July of 1969, he said it's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Well, while Armstrong said mankind, we would actually understand that to be both men and women, right? Nobody would doubt that. And so it was the same way when they used the word brother in Paul's letter, it meant brothers and sisters. And we're just recognizing that as translators, and also the fact that there's more women reading Bibles by statistics than there are men. So we want to include them. But there are other areas, obviously, where we wouldn't do that, where it wouldn't make sense. So yeah, there's decisions you must make as a translator, and sometimes it's really hard. Yes, others it just makes sense.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you like content like this, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.